today I'm joining with Ovi. I never actually say your last name, Ovi. Is it Bhuiyan?
Bhuiyan, yeah, pretty close.
Bhuiyan, close. I've known Ovi for a long time. Ovi's been like all over the industry. I'm going to let you intro yourself. I'm going to dive into like probably what you're going to say first, but I'll let you intro yourself real quick.
Yeah, man, of course. Yeah. So I'm Ovi. I've been, I got into the industry right out of law school. I joined Riot, where I used to run day-to-day operations for LCS back in like 2014. So this is like the second season that the league was around. And then stayed at Riot for about 3.5, 4 years. And then from there, I went to set up an esports consultancy with a couple of friends. And basically when that first traditional sports wave came in with like the Golden State Warriors and a bunch of NBA teams and folks, did a bunch of work there. And then since then, I've worked with influencers, creators, so always in the games industry. But got my start with esports, and it's always like first in my heart.
Hell yeah. So that's where I wanted to start the whole Riot Games era. So you were at Riot Games when they really like paved the way with everything, right? I mean, you could say that like esports kind of began with, I guess, like StarCraft and like the early CS days. But I think it really blew up around that time you were in Riot. Like, what was that like in-house? Like, I mean, 2014, that had to be when the money started pumping into gaming, no?
No, it was a little early still at the time. At the time that I was at Riot, Dustin Beck was the head of esports. He was the brother of Brandon, which was kind of a funny story because he was a little skeptical about joining Riot because he's like brothers with the CEO, and he had a job at Goldman Sachs. So he was like doing his finance life. But Riot was just really blowing up, and it was a cool opportunity. And Brandon really wanted someone he trusted to run esports. So Dustin came in, and he used to say like esports is the coolest thing no one's ever heard of. Keep in mind, he was saying this 10 years ago. And yeah, I think, to your point, I feel like the philosophy at Riot was basically like, yeah, this is a very cool thing that has a chance to be as big as traditional sports, which was kind of like the mental model everyone had. But it was really just, I think the experience of Riot in those early days was like knowing what you want it to be, but having to deal with where it is. So like, you had this industry that was like super unprofessional, super like fly by night, a lot of shady characters, a lot of good people too. But, esports has always had like very low barriers to entry. So like all types of people can get in. And so I think it was a really exciting time, honestly. Like I feel like Riot, there was not a huge pressure to make it profitable, I think, which was like kind of the thing that was really exciting about Riot to me. It was like, we believe in making a great product, and then the business model and stuff will figure itself out. But yeah, in those early days, man, it was the Wild West. It was pretty incredible. I remember when I was in the LCS, one of the first things I did when I came on board Riot is we were like, all right, we should have coaches. And so honestly, at the time, the teams did not want coaches. They were like, we don't need coaches. Some of the teams had players that were good at pick ban. So they were like, once we have professional coaches, that's going to like cut away at our edge. So Riot literally paid for coaches' salaries to begin with. And I'll never forget, I won't name him, but there's this one team owner who didn't want a coach. He was like, I'm against the idea of coaches. I refuse. And I was like, okay, but we're paying for the coach. And I promise you a coach is a good idea. But even if you don't believe me, Riot's going to pay for the salary. Like, what's the downside here? And he was like, I want to bring in my dog as the coach. And I was like, I can't believe this is real right now. Like, you should find like a smart 20-year-old kid who understands League of Legends and pay them the salary. And he's like, no, I'm protesting. I want Animal as my coach. And I was like, we're not going to let you do that. He's like, there's no rule against it. And I was like, this is the kind of stuff that people don't tell you about when they talk about the back of the industry.
Yeah, that's actually absurd. I didn't know that Riot funded like the coaches initially in League of Legends, because coming from CS, that couldn't be more different, right? I feel like,
yeah.
And this is like something that I think we're going to dabble into in a little bit, is the difference amongst these like big developers and the core stakeholders in this industry. But coming from Valve as like an ex-CSGO pro, they actively didn't want the coaches involved in the game because they wanted the experience at the pro level to feel like matchmaking. If you're viewing professional esports in Counter-Strike, they want you to feel like you're viewing a really good matchmaking game. And it sounds like that wasn't the objective early on in League of Legends. Like, do you think that I mean, shit, I'll just ask right off the bat, like, because I think there's been a lot of people that have come into this industry that have tried to make it like traditional sports. Do you think that that was one of those first steps in that direction?
At the time, no. I think the idea was just that, like, hey, we want to have a better product and higher level of competition. It's not a brilliant insight to have the idea that, like, someone who is, like, fully... Because obviously the players are focused on the game, right? It requires an enormous amount of concentration to actually, like, perform in game. So having... we're talking about reinventing the wheel here, right? Like, it's very basic that in basically every competitive endeavor I can imagine, typically coaches are a thing. And so it wasn't so much we want to be like traditional sports as it like, what is the next evolution of this? Like, how do we get higher level competition? And one of the lowest hanging pieces of fruit was like coaches. This is not a new idea. It's like very, very well proven to be a good idea for improving performance.
Yeah, it does make total sense on like the coaching realm. It's just, I bet, like, I'm sure you've seen this as well over your years in the industry. Do you feel like it's kind of like ballooned too much? Like, it expanded too quick, basically. Because now we're kind of getting into, I guess, you recently released this, for lack of a better word, just like dissertation about the problems in esports and why this industry has been like suffering so much. And I think a lot of people, I hate using the term, but like esports winter, currently what the industry is kind of going through. Do you think that it is like unsustainable based on how it has grown from those early days?
Yeah, I mean, right back to the beginning of the pod, when you were sort of referencing like esports kind of started with StarCraft and now it's here. If you think about it, I think esports is actually generally pretty cyclical. Like we could go back to like the Donkey Kong era when people were like putting quarters in arcades and like the early Evo days in the 1990s. I don't want to bore people with like going through like deep history, but my point is just that like the idea of people playing video games at a high level and people paying to watch them has been around for like, 30 plus years. Obviously, it was much smaller back in the day. But the point is that I think at different eras, people had different visions for what the industry was supposed to look like. So originally it was like, oh, it's sort of like, it's just like community gatherings, essentially, like closer to like grassroots chess, maybe. And then most recently it was like the traditional sports era. And I think this era, I think of it less like esports is dead or dying and more like this era of esports where people were like, what we need in esports is to basically make it like traditional sports. And we can get into the reasons why I think that is not a good analogy. But I don't think it's a dumb idea. I think it's a reasonable thesis. It's just unfortunately wrong. And so I think we're just... Yeah, I think the traditional sports model, for a bunch of reasons, is just not right for esports. Esports is sort of like video games, sort of like sports, obviously, right? There's a lot of similarities, players playing, but I think it's closer to video games than sports.
I couldn't agree more. So looking at it like a traditional sport, I'll kind of like maybe put a little bit of words in your mouth, but I'm sure the key thing you're going to say is that someone actually owns the intellectual property of the game itself, right? So Riot owns League of Legends and no one owns football, right? So because of that, you can monetize in different ways. You can sell broadcast rights. You can do all of these things to create value and generate revenue. Also, there's localized fan bases. There's government help when it comes to building these facilities. There's all kind of things in traditional sports. So what are the similarities, though? Like, what similarities do you see? I'll make you play like the other side of the coin, because you did a lot actually in the article of saying like what's not similar. I'm curious how these things initially came about, because I think the closest similarity that I've ever heard was actually from Andreas at Loaded, who he said that it was most similar to golf. Or at least the Counter-Strike circuit was most similar to golf. And I like that. And I hadn't heard anyone say that yet, because it's kind of like you travel around, you play with all these different tournament organizers. There's different people that you're playing for, different places, different fan bases are seeing you. And people watch golf as players of golf. I don't watch LeBron James and buy his shoes thinking that it's going to make me dunk. But if I watch whatever golfer with their putter, I'm buying that putter because I believe it's going to make me a better golfer. Do you think that that's a fair comparison?
Yeah, man, there's so much to unpack there. I guess like I will take the other side of this, but let me just lay out real quick how I see it. So I think there's like a couple of key differences with traditional sports. The reason why I think it's fair to say that I have a lot of sympathy, and I was one of the people who, 7 years ago thought like, yeah, esports, traditional sports, like NBA is an aspirational thing. It's like at core, esports is an entertainment product. And the value proposition is basically, hey, you pay money or watch ads, and in exchange, you get to watch people playing this game at the highest possible level, which is basically the same deal that you offer to a FIFA fan or an NBA fan. So I think from a product level, I think esports and traditional sports are pretty similar. You have athletes, oh my God, that's a whole thing. But like you have competitors playing a game at the highest possible level, competing for a championship. We crown a winner, fans cheering. I think there's actually a lot of product similarities. The businesses, though, are very different for a couple of reasons, and we'll go. I'm happy to go into them if you want, but I guess like
please.
Top line level, I would say the biggest difference is that, and any gamer knows this, games are popular for a very short amount of time. If we look at, I've said, esports has been around for 30 years. 30 years ago, the top sports in the United States were basketball, football, and baseball. 30 years later, can you guess what the top three sports are?
Yeah, right? I mean, they're not changing.
They haven't changed. Yeah. 30 years ago, first of all, mobile phones didn't exist. So, I mean, we're talking about a category that didn't exist. But then also, obviously, the games are completely different. CS is actually maybe an interesting one where I don't think CS was out 30 years ago, but it's gotten there. And same with maybe like Smash Brothers. But for the most part, most games get drift in popularity within a year at best. And then you have these outliers, games that do really well, like League of Legends and CS, but those are like very, very, very few games that can do that. And what's more common is, games like Overwatch, which have, maybe 2-3 years in them, but then, it's just so competitive. Like Warzone comes out, Fortnite comes out, Apex comes out. It's a never ending stream of new games that they have to compete with. There is no soccer too. Like pickleball is not going to eat the NFL's lunch in the way that like Apex can maybe eat Fortnite's. So it's just totally, because you have such a short amount of time to capitalize on a game's popularity. It just means that the business dynamics have to be completely different from traditional sports. There's other reasons too, but I think that's the biggest problem is, when you start building an NFL stadium, you assume that football is still going to be popular by the time the stadium's done. That might not be true for an esport. You start building an arena in 2017 for Overwatch, by 2023, the league's gone,
And talking about that, yeah, like Overwatch League is gone. So like a lot of these developers did buy into kind of them having the next sport. And I would even say like Riot, when you were there, kind of aided in that, right? With the 10 mil buy-in for these franchise slots in League of Legends. We saw, probably like 18 months ago, Misfits sold their LEC slot for what, like $30 million. Do you know the number?
I have to look it up.
I think it was like 35 mil, something like that. Maybe like 30 mil euros or something like that. This was like 18 months ago. And I don't know, did you see the news yesterday that Shopify bought TSM slot for 10 mil, their LCL slot? Mm-hmm. So like with that kind of fluctuation in like valuation for, I mean, I guess like the crown jewel esport in the last like 10 years, right? League of Legends. Mm-hmm. I understand it might be slightly getting older, but how, I mean, you know better than I would, this is your realm. Like, how do you maintain investment with that kind of fluctuation? Like what do you tell people when that kind of data is available?
I think, so one thing I will say is that I think it's important, to have grace that none of us, this is a frontier area, right? Like none of us, there's not like basketball, football is a better example. That's been around for like decades upon decades. There is some innovation happening, but there's a long body of work for people to understand what is a football team worth, how do they monetize, how, as trends move up and down, how will the values fluctuate? But with esports, it's been around at this level for such a short amount of time, it's hard to tell. So I think one thing that I would take heart from is like, if you look at how Valorant is handling, partnership instead of franchising, Riot has already learned a bunch of lessons, and it looks like they've all like buy-ins are less. They're not permanent partnerships in quite the same way. There's many fewer teams. The regions have sort of a tournament structure such that they play each other more often than Worlds. My point is just that I think if Riot could go back in time and not have to go through the period of like learning a bunch of painful lessons and just implement them, I think they would have structured League of Legends closer to what Valorant looks like today, because with Valorant, they got that chance. But yeah, I mean, I think League of Legends has a structure and a system that was testing this idea that esports is traditional sports. That model, I think, I don't think people are dumb. I just think we've gotten a lot more data about the fact that that model is probably off for a variety of reasons. And so they're doing the best they can with the model that they have.
Yeah. So have you followed at all? I do agree, like the Valorant system is a lot better than what I've seen in like League of Legends.
Designed by the same folks, right?
Yeah. They did do a lot of like very important changes for the ecosystem. Like they didn't require the teams have challenger teams, which was a huge money sink initially in League of Legends. I think there's a lot of reasons why League of Legends became so difficult to sustain for these orgs. They ended up in like an arms race to buy these top players from different regions. And I think there could have been like regulations set in place by Riot to prevent some of those things and thus keep salaries in check. But kind of going into what you said, you're talking about like the value of the LCS or, Valorant Partnership League. How do you feel about that compared to like Valve's approach, completely hands off? Because one side you have a developer that wants full control of everything and like rules their IP with like an iron fist, right? You can't run a tournament without their permission. You can't create merch without their permission. You can't do anything without Riot's permission in this particular title. But Valve is so different. Like they could give two shits what's going on half of the year, and randomly they'll make a statement, they'll change some things about the game, and it seems like they're almost just getting free marketing forever. Like they don't pay for any of this stuff. Valve is a company that they own Steam, right? They own Steam.
Yeah, exactly.
So they have like 300 something employees, and they own Steam. Like that's kind of crazy, no? Like,
yeah.
That's crazy.
I think the way the publishers look at it, for what it's worth, and because I've worked at a publisher and I've kind of seen the inside machinery of how it all works, I'm very sympathetic to that position. Is that like I've heard teams describe it as free marketing, but I think it's sort of symbiotic, right? In the sense that I don't see esports teams lining up to create teams in bad games with no player base, right? Yeah. There's a very good reason why all the biggest esports are also games with at least 10 million monthly active players. It's not a coincidence, right? Trying to build an esport around a game that's not particularly popular is a death sentence. I've never seen it work. Maybe you know of an example, but I don't. And so there's kind of value going both ways. Like it is true that I think esports generates some marketing value, but Valve doesn't look to take a percentage of teams' ad revenue or sponsorships or things like that. And so it's kind of an odd agreement, honestly. I think the way that Valve does it is pretty unusual. I think no other publisher would do it that way. And I think it's exactly what you said. It's because I say this respectfully, but I think Valve is a game storefront company that does game development as like a side business. Yeah. If you look at their P&L, I think that's a very fair way of describing that company. Of course they are game developers at heart. I'm not trying to diss anyone here, but like, if you look at where they make their money, it's from the game storefront. That's like priority A, B, C, and D. So I think that both approaches are interesting. I think personally for me, the Valve approach I would be a little nervous about the Valve approach just because you never know what Valve's going to do. Like, for example, the recent ending of the Battle Pass for TI, right? If you had made a big investment into Dota 2, now Valve's never promised you anything, so it's not like they reneged or anything like that, but that'd be a disaster for you. It's like all of a sudden the whole economic of the esports ecosystem changes overnight without your input. Or like when, CS ecosystem, and this is really your wheelhouse, but my understanding is that it's been consolidating, right? With like Faceit, ESL. It's basically Blast and ESL now. And, Valve has now said, hey, we don't like this tournament organizer team commingling. We want there to be a more open circuit. We're going to have these rules in 2025. in some way that might even be a great outcome, but no one knew that was going to happen 6 months ago, right? And so I just think the Valve ecosystem, Valve doesn't interfere as much, which is a pro, but the con of never knowing what Valve will want is like, it's just a risk you have to take into account.
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. Because all the developers, it's like kind of pick your poison, right? Like Riot side is very control heavy. Valve is obviously very hands off. Then you have someone like Nintendo. And I saw what you wrote in your article. And I just think like Nintendo, they just are operating differently because of just the first mover advantage. Like, every kid just knows what Super Mario is, right? Every kid grows up with that as like their gateway drug into gaming. And they didn't need to market to esports. I mean, they never have. They don't have microtransactions in their games in the way that Counter-Strike or Valorant does. So why the fuck would they care about esports, you know? And you have all these developers that have different goals. And it's very hard to see like which one is going to end up winning in the end, or like which way is the right way. I'm inclined to believe, I think Riot is doing a lot of things to fix the ecosystem, but I also think the freedom to have like your own tournaments and create your own value from the developer, the way that exists in Counter-Strike, that's super important to me. Like, I think that caused a lot of suffering in the tier 2 scene in Valorant this year. So many big orgs pulled out of the tier 2 scene. And just yesterday we saw like Moist merge with Shopify. You know, like all of the influencer teams are hurting. They thought it would be like easier than it was, I guess. I don't foresee that getting any better soon. Do you?
No, I think that's kind of the dynamic. And this is kind of one of the core challenges of esports. It's like you're building on top of someone else's land, essentially. Like esports is a rental business. Riot is always going to care about League of Legends more than they care about League of Legends esports, right? Like Valve will always care about Counter-Strike more than Counter-Strike esports, and on and on and on. That doesn't mean they don't care about esports. I want to be really clear. But it's like these games are being built on top of incredibly valuable IP. And like we talked about earlier, if you built on top of a worthless IP and a terrible game, I'm sure the developer would offer you an amazing deal. I've seen it behind the scenes, but teams are, I think, wisely not interested in that because you can't really build on top of a bad game. So yeah, I mean, it's a tough dynamic, but the reality is like, yeah, you're trying to build on top of someone else's IP and it's really valuable IP. It's just really tough to do that. You don't, yeah.
So, yeah. And here's like a tricky question, because like I don't really know where I'm like what these waters even look like, but I am aware of like the Kespa Blizzard dispute way back when. Do you know what I'm talking about? In 2011?
Yeah.
Where basically Kespa fought for rights, like broadcast rights, against the developer. Do you think anything like that could ever happen again in esports, where like, say, tournament organizers or teams even band together for IP rights within the game, like make it some kind of like public domain, so that way they're a little bit more free to move around?
I don't know the legal structure of every country in the world. Like, for example, LCK, the Korean League of Legends League, just instituted, I believe, price controls that would be unconstitutional in the United States. So maybe there's a country or jurisdiction where you could do that, where teams and other publishers could try and make an argument like that. But from my understanding of IP law, that's very unlikely in the United States to work. And I think publishers would rather end esports altogether rather than risk other people being able to use their IP. At some level, this is sort of like saying like, hey, shouldn't Mickey Mouse fans be allowed to create their own Mickey Mouse movies? And it's like, Disney would say no, and you're sued. You're sued for even thinking it. I think publishers feel similarly about their IP. It's tricky, man. I understand. I think the best balance is an uncomfortable one, which is where like, yeah, third parties have to work together with publishers. Because at the end of the day, like, let's just break it down, right? Like, publishers own the IP, so why don't they just do the whole thing themselves? Why do they even bother working with teams and third parties? Yeah. Well, turns out they're good at making games, but running tournaments, creating content, creating teams, that's not what they're good at. That's not their core expertise. So what they'd love to do, and this is one reason why traditional sports era kicked off, is that like, well, you know who knows how to make a team is like NBA teams or people that have built big entertainment brands. So why don't we partner with them? We'll give them some upside, and in exchange, they deliver for us. I think the results have been mixed so far. Unfortunately, I think most of the professional sports teams have not broken through in the way that they have maybe in traditional sports. I don't think there is a New York Yankees of esports in that sense. And so, yeah, publishers, they're just trying to figure out how do we build up our IP in a cool way with these esports storylines and products and give up just enough so that it incentivizes people to build. And then third parties are like, man, how do we get publishers to give us as much as possible? And so I think the answer, man, to be honest with you, is just like monetization of esports. Like I think, broadcast rights for esports are super low value right now in general. And in general, I think like monetization of esports is really weak. It's one of the things that I outline as like a productive suggestion is, video games, it's all about microtransactions with live service games. But with esports, like think about it. How can you, if you're a big esports fan, what is even available to you to purchase? Like you can buy a jersey.
Yeah.
You can buy a jersey. You can go to a live event. There's probably a few other things, right? Subscriptions, et cetera, et cetera. But that's like, I just think there's very little. I think it'd be really interesting if people experimented with things like, kind of like what VTubers do with like being able to like pay money to maybe like change the stream experience or creating basically ways for people to interact with esports competitions in exchange for money. I think that'd be a really interesting space to mess around with, and publishers would love it because it doesn't affect their underlying game. It's just about the esport. And so I think that kind of like esports specific monetization is how you make this all, I think, more sustainable.
I think you hit the nail on the head. And maybe I'm about to like go out on a limb here, but maybe I'm giving like too much credit to Riot. But have you seen, I'm sure you have, that they're building a streaming platform?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So John Needham has recently said they're like making this streaming platform. I think if they're going to drive any traffic into that platform, the only way to do it is to get all of the teams, the players, big influencers pushing traffic to it. And within that streaming platform, John Needham's already said that there's going to be microtransactions available that because it's tied to your Riot Games account. So it would know if you're missing a skin, it could promote that skin. Like it has advanced algos on your spending patterns. If you watch an ace with Ye with this skin, it could then push that skin to you. And you would immediately know based on the analytics within that platform whether that money came from esports or not. Because that was something you mentioned in your article, and I couldn't agree more. Like say they release the Champions Bundle in Valorant, right? That skin just looks cool. If I buy that skin, that doesn't mean that I'm supporting the esport.
Yeah.
It could mean that I'm supporting the esport, like because I like Champions, I like this skin, I'm going to support it. That's what happens for me. But little Johnny down the street who's 7 years old, like he's not watching the tournament. He just thinks this thing is sick. Like this skin is really cool and I want my mom to buy it for me. But having your own streaming platform like that, where you're pretty much like probably only going to stream the esport itself. I don't know what else they would put on there. Like, am I gonna lie? Like maybe like stuff with the devs, maybe like exclusive content, but you would be able to like package things in such a way where you could offer experiences to people that they couldn't get on Twitch. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they're building it out where you could like watch individual player cams or support teams in certain ways, or I don't know, you could do like overlays and stuff. You could change like the lighting in the studio. I think that was something was that something that was in your article?
Yeah.
So like you can do like all kind of stuff like that with microtransactions. And I just feel like that is where I think this is going to head. But I don't know if that's a good place. Is that a good place when the developer owns the platform? The two biggest stakeholders in this industry, the platforms and the devs.
Yeah, I mean, I just got done saying that game publishers are world-class at making games and, creating sports teams and competitive content is not their zone of genius, which is why they bring in third parties. Creating a streaming platform, also not game development, also a different endeavor altogether. So at some point you're creating this like Russian nesting doll of side projects to try and make them all profitable. I do think it's a smart idea. When I was kind of going through the research process of writing like the essays, I was trying to understand more about traditional sports business models. And so I went into like, basketball, but also I went into stuff like wrestling, tennis, et cetera. And it's really interesting to me. Like basically, I don't think this is shocking to most people, but I was a little surprised by wrestling. Do you watch like WWE or any of that stuff?
No, but Golden Boy is a huge fan, so I get like the rumblings of what's going on. So I might know a little bit.
Well, I mean, so high level, like I think, traditional sports, I think everyone knows that broadcast rights deals are everything, more than 50% of revenue for basically every major sport. But wrestling has this culture of like, essentially live events like SummerSlam. I don't watch wrestling that much. I'm sure I'll get corrected, but there's a ton of wrestling events. But despite having all these events, it still is dwarfed by their TV rights deals. Essentially, TV rights deals are where most of the value comes from for most sports. And for a variety of reasons, esports broadcast rights are horrendously monetized in the West. I have heard in China and some markets that they do a much better job, but at least speaking in the Western market, not so good. Real far behind traditional sports. And so I think from Riot's perspective, at some point, it's like, well, if Twitch and YouTube aren't going to be willing to pay for this, you either accept that L, which I think is a pretty tough L to accept if you're serious about esports, or you just build it yourself. And so I think it's the right move. It's really hard is the thing to build a streaming platform. And how are people engaging with it when the esports events aren't on, which is most of the time? These are important questions for like Riot to figure out, but I think it is the correct move, even if it's not the ideal move, if that makes sense. Ideally, Twitch just gave you the bag, right? That would be the ideal, but it's not.
Yeah. So do you think like, you mentioned the whole like broadcast rights deal, and I like thought about this too. And isn't it actively in a developer's best interest to not do a deal like that? Why would you want to have your game broadcast in a limited amount of places and reach less eyeballs when essentially it's just a marketing tool for the game itself? Don't you want as many people to see as possible? Isn't that why co-streamers are now a thing? I mean, if this was like a tournament organizer that was like selling their particular broadcast and selling sponsorships on that broadcast, it would be important to keep it all in one place probably. But from a developer's point of view, they don't really care. At least in my eyes, like that's what it seems like.
I think you just beautifully outlined something that has created like infinite meetings at game publishers, which is like, yeah, there's like a core trade-off. You're exactly right. On the one hand, esports is promotion, so you want as many people to watch the game being showcased as possible. On the other hand, no one's going to pay huge amounts of money for non-exclusive, right? I don't know, maybe Kick, but that's a whole other rabbit hole. Wait, say again?
Didn't Major League Baseball do it like years back or some shit? Like non-exclusive rights for the LCS? Some crazy, right?
Oh yeah, I think they wanted to create, MLBAM wanted to create like, that was a whole thing, yeah. Major League Baseball's, they had like a basically third-party streaming service creator that ultimately I think got bought out by Disney, as I recall. But their idea was that they were going to actually buy the rights and monetize the rights to League of Legends, as I recall. But it's been a minute. That was like 10 years ago. Yeah, I think at core, the answer to your question is it is a trade-off. And the thing that I think a lot of people in esports forget, though, is that there's a lot of ways to market video games. Esports is not the only way to market video games. You just talked about co-streamers. Every game publisher worth their salt has a department or some people that manage influencer campaigns. They also have people that manage direct spend campaigns. So like whether that's buying television ads or Google ads or targeted advertising on other platforms like Facebook. The point is that even if there aren't as many eyeballs as possible on your esports product, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to market your game. It just means that maybe you focus on other arenas to raise awareness, not just esports. But yeah, I think it's a trade-off. And in most cases, if you're serious about esports, you probably have to be willing to, if you're serious about monetizing esports, exclusivity for broadcast rights is just a given. It's just table stakes. Otherwise, why would someone pay for something that can be broadcast anywhere?
Yeah. I think like, so I go back and forth with it. Like, I don't know how the orgs, I guess in CS's case, like the TOs would make this profitable. Like, I guess from where it's at, they would have to significantly cut costs if it's the case that the developer will keep basically doing business as usual as it is like right now, as far as like revenue sharing and access to like IP, right?
Are you still talking about like media rights? I know Valorant well, CS is a little bit different, right? I'm sure you know more about that than I do. I mean, CS, no one can really sell CS rights because no one owns it except Valve, but you can basically do, I guess, like Blast can cut their own deal, ESL can cut their own deal with their content, et cetera, for as long as Valve will allow that. Again, this is why I think the Valve approach, it's just a different set of trade-offs. I think the sustainability just has to come from making. You basically have to do one of two things, I think. You either have to figure out how to monetize your super fans better. So that's with like things like I was talking about, like maybe microtransactions or things like that. Things that can basically, like in the same way that people are willing to donate money on stream to watch a streamer do something or interact with them. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit different with an esports tournament, but I think that same behavior of like, I pay money to see my experience personalized around me a little bit. I think that's one edge or one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is basically getting way more popular. And I don't know that there's any game right now that I'm sure is that. Maybe CS is the closest because I think, an average person can watch CS for 5 minutes to understand what's going on. But I think the status quo esports are not super popular in the grand scheme of like the entire global audience, and they're not monetizing their super fans particularly well, in my opinion. So yeah, I think this status quo is obviously not it. So it's just, it'll vary by game, but like, which way do you go? Do you get more popular or do you try and I mean, way more popular. I don't mean like double your viewership. I mean like people that don't even play the game are familiar with your product. Or do you monetize your super fans better?
The teams. Let's move on to the teams now. Mm-hmm. Do you think the teams in their current state are like sustainable? Do you think that like they took that VC money in the last decade and did the right things with that money? Do you think like they made the right expansions, like as far as like buying, the right facilities or buying the right teams or, scaling up their socials, their merch? Like, what do you think was the correct play, like in hindsight? And do you think any of the orgs did a really good job of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what you think a team is. So I think a lot of teams took money from investors who are like, how do I own the New York Yankees of esports? And that was the whole mental model. It was like, how do I invest in an organization that's going to be in all the big esports, will have the most fans and make the most money? And I think, as we talked about, I don't think traditional sports teams are the right model for esports. So I think what happened to be this is maybe an unpopular opinion. You tell me, man. But my opinion is that a lot of teams basically got a ton of money, and it's really hard to build brand. Like, I think the most important thing for these esports teams, because I don't think very few games are going to be around for 30 years. So if you're going to be jumping from game to game to game, the most important thing you can do is to build a really strong brand for your organization. And I think what a lot of teams did is it's really hard to build brands. And so they were essentially like, well, I'm not entirely sure how to build a brand, but if I win titles, no one can doubt that I'm doing a good job. So basically it set off, and I don't blame players for this. This is the free market at work. Everyone, or not everyone, but a lot of teams decided, all right, not sure how to build a brand, but I do know how to win games, which is just pay for the best players. And so salaries went through the roof. Teams have burned so much money. And again, I don't blame players. Get the bag. Like this is how free market works. But a lot of that money is incinerated. Like once that player's gone, once that player retires, that money's gone forever. You didn't invest it in something that's going to pay dividends down the road. And so, yeah, I just think a lot of teams really tried hard to build a brand of winning which is fine until you're not winning, and then your brand's worthless, right? And so I think people, I think like 100 Thieves in some ways did a really great job of trying to make something that wasn't just about winning. Of course, they, bang on the drum a lot when they win games and they want to win. But I think if you say 100 Thieves, there's like associations with streetwear and anime and other stuff or like influencers that's really interesting and exists beyond just we win games, like maybe I don't know, like a TSM, for example. The teams that have done it best are really trying to build brands, but I don't know if you need to buy a $20 million facility and pay 7 figures to 30 kids across 5 different esports to build a brand.
Yeah, I definitely think like they could have done better initially, like with those initial investments. But again, like I totally see how it happened, right? Like, yeah, they needed to take the money to buy into a lot of these slots. And then, like you said, like in order to get ahead, get the most visibility, the most splash within the scene, they wanted to make these big purchases. They wanted to bring in imports that were most known by the players in the scene. They wanted to win championships, and they were bidding against each other. The salaries got out of control. And yeah, they just burned through like a lot of the money, I feel like, that was coming in. With all of this known, like, so you're saying like the devs likely won't concede too much because like you said, like esports is just a minor fraction of their product. The main game is their product, and they don't want to harm their main product, right? So you can't just flood your esports marketplace with skins for all of these teams all throughout the year. That will then decrease the value of a normal skin, which is what drives your revenue. How do these teams get out of this sinkhole at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you break the cycle here is you have to, if there's one thing that a listener takes away from this pod on my end, is just like esports specific revenue. You got to, I think a lot of people have been focused on this narrative that like publishers are greedy. They're actually making lots of money off esports secretly. I can tell you that's not true. Like publisher, maybe it's true for some game. I don't know every single game and every single publisher. I don't think anyone on earth does, but I have a ton of insight from not just Riot Games, like Valve and a couple other, quite a few ecosystems. And in general, there's not a strong data case from any ecosystem I'm super familiar with that esports creates massive amounts of value that the publisher pockets. It's closer to a marketing campaign for them in most cases. Now, I do think some people like Riot view it as like, this can become over time something really special. And, I think of like Arcane, for example, right? I don't know that Riot made hundreds of millions of dollars off of Arcane. I don't know that Arcane was the most profitable thing Riot's ever done, but that doesn't matter, right? The reason why Arcane's so valuable is that it raises the profile of the League of Legends IP to people that don't even know what League of Legends is, right? Like I have friends that have never played a game of League, but they know who Vi is because they watched Arcane. And so I think from Riot's perspective, like I'm not speaking for Riot here, but I think it's kind of similar to Nintendo in a way, right? Like Nintendo, the reason why they create Nintendo theme parks and Nintendo movies, it's not, of course they want to make money, but that's not the primary reason. I think the primary reason is that it creates this virtuous cycle of, like you said, like, oh, kids get indoctrinated into Mario from a young age. So it just makes it so much easier for Nintendo to like build resonance with their products. I think Riot wants to find their version of that. And I think esports is one piece of the puzzle. I think other publishers who think in that way can value esports. And I think that's really the way you got to go. So yeah, sorry, I went on a tangent. The point is esports specific revenue. I think most publishers are actually pretty chill with sharing esports revenue. It's when you start asking for rev share on the game itself that things start getting a little heated. And so I think like that's a conversation that I'm sure teams and publishers will fight about till the end of time. But where I think there's a natural energy to cooperate, momentum to cooperate is like, how do we monetize esports better? How do we make those broadcast rights worth something? How do we make the equivalent of microtransactions for esports events watchers? And there's going to be a lot of failure along the way. I don't know the answer to that question, man. Maybe you do, but I don't. And so it's going to take a ton of iteration. It's not going to happen overnight. But I think that's so much more promising than like trying to get a publisher to create more esports skins and rev share on them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think the answer is like more skins like within their game, because then you're really fucking with their core business at that point. And at that point, you're just going to drive the developers away from esports because it is just like an added marketing campaign for them. But there clearly is value. I mean, like I'm looking at like Adam Apicella's tweet about, you know, the Champions final just now that I was at for Valorant. And he speculates that it's anywhere from like $35 to $70 million for that show.
Right.
I mean, like that's kind of like
in costs for the live event.
Yeah,
right?
just for like a 1 day event, right? Like just a 1 day event. And
probably not profitable, I would guess.
It was an amazing spectacle. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
But that's why they did it, because they could draw someone like Elon Musk into the arena, you know, like they could be on the headlines everywhere with this amazing pre-show. And it's all about the optics when it comes to Riot. That's why it's so interesting, because they are very hands-on and they do care a lot. It's just, your question would be like, well, is the money being spent in the right ways for the sustainability of the scene? And like, that's what's like unsure. Like, do you think what they're doing to like push the marketing forward, like expand the audience of the game, do you think that's the best purpose for that money? Or do you think like that money would be better served filtering through the scene itself, like the ecosystem?
I have a different answer for what I, as a fan, would like to see. And I'm sure if I were a team owner, I'd have a different answer. And if I was a player, I'd have a different answer.
Yeah.
But if we just think about it with like our business hats on for a minute, from Riot's perspective, they want return on investment. Like, one thing that I talk about a lot to people is like, let's keep in mind, as much as Riot is positive about esports, they're disciplined in some ways. They cut Wild Esports, right? Or sorry, Wild Rift Esports outside of the Asian region. And so I don't know exactly how well those, when they were doing NA Wild Rift events, EU Wild Rift events, I don't know exactly how well those were doing, but clearly it didn't do well enough for Riot to continue. So we know that there is a bright line, a point at which, even though Riot is pro esports and Riot has amazing games, there's a point at which they look at the P&L and they're like, nope, we're cutting it. Not worth. And so if Riot is really focused on, at some level, how do we get a return on our investment? I think the tricky thing is that Riot's, even this was true when I was there, like Riot's willing to take losses, right? If you're trying to build IP, you're not going to be profitable overnight. There's no such thing. You have to sustain losses over a period of time if you really are serious about trying to invest into something. But the hope is that you build something intergenerational like Mario or Pokemon, and then you'll, you know, reap decades of rewards for like years of losses, ideally. I think esports is an important way for Riot to promote. But again, man, like I talk about it in the piece, but like, remember, like Epic Games burned like $150+ million on esports, right? Yeah. It's like one of the most spectacular incinerations of cash I've ever seen in this industry. And then they stopped, right? And what was it, 2021 after the pandemic? Because, you know, they just lost gobs and gobs of money, and, you know, those losses were all publicized because of the Apple trial. But they didn't give up on marketing, obviously. They just started working with influencers. And like when they did, with Gref, when they did a Fortnite skin reveal with Gref, the viewership for that was higher than a CSGO major. It was higher than Worlds on Twitch. Obviously, you know, CSGO majors and Worlds are on multiple platforms. But the point is that like influencers can drive amazing amount of eyeballs in marketing. And so I think esports, like, you just have to figure out, how can it be valuable enough to be worth it? And so your question, like, is a $75 million event worth it for Riot? Presumably yes, but as we know from Wild Rift, at some point you have to show results or else they'll start cutting back. Yeah,
and that's like, I guess that's like the core problem of the industry that has been created, right? Like in these recent years, I feel like advertisers have realized, like, why the fuck am I paying this company that's going to overcharge for this one-time day more money than I would pay Shroud to stream from his bedroom and get like more unique viewers?
Yeah, I mean,
because I feel like the influencers have like taken over, right? Like, I mean, it's like, why would you support the esport when you could just work with, you know, a company like Loaded and like bucket in a bunch of influencers and get reach across like all of gaming? What's the point?
That is an excellent question. I think my friends at Loaded will be like, yes.
I mean, like anyone, WME, Loaded, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that is fundamentally true, but I also think that it's true that like there are some audiences that are specifically competitively oriented. And I also think that the type of engagement is different. Like there aren't really, you can work with a Gref or, a huge big name streamer, but they're not going to be available for like live events at the cadence that esports can offer. There's some differences here, I guess is what I'm driving at. And over time, if you can build a relationship with an esport or a team that you believe will be around for the long haul, tough to do, tough to know for sure. You can get a level of reach and kind of like a long-term relationship with that esport or those teams that is valuable. But yeah, at core, I think this is one of the things, man, that back in the day, like when esports was really first popping off in this era around 2012, 2013, I think most of the biggest influencers on Twitch were esports players or would go on to become pro players. But today that's no longer true. In fact, it's the other way around. A lot of retired pro players like Shroud or Ninja or some of these other folks go on to become massive creators.
How dare you not include our Lord and Savior, Tarek.
And Tarek. Tarek, of course.
He won us a major. Come on now.
Tarek won. No, for sure. I was at that major.
It was great.
Fantastic.
Oh my God. So what do you think is the play for like these developers like Riot who have created, franchise leagues, say like, in League of Legends or Valorant? Do they have obligation to continue these franchises? Like does there need to be of League of Legends 2 or Valorant 2? Do they need to keep expanding these esports because they've caused, these organizations to buy into these leagues? And what happens if the game, like kind of the league dissolves the way Overwatch does or did, the Overwatch League? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of those things where like, I think the learnings of the Overwatch League have kind of been sobering for everyone. And so I think like, my understanding of VCT at least is that like, you don't have permanent contracts to be in VCT. Like it's an ongoing process to continue to be part of the league. So it feels like there's organic breakpoints for them. And similarly is anyone else really, it's really just Valve and Riot these days, right? I mean, of course there's Supercell and Ubisoft, but I don't think anyone's really running like organized leagues as much outside of Riot and Valve ecosystems.
No, I can't think of any.
In the West, yeah.
Is Apex doing that right now?
Good point. Apex is a counterexample. That's a fair point. And Apex is an interesting one, man, because like I think EA is much more like traditional business like than say like Valve. Like they're a publicly traded company. They want to profit maximize. And I don't know if you saw a couple months back, the team, they basically sold banners in the game, which is like it's not quite a skin, but it's like a cosmetic, and the sales were atrocious. They were really bad, like really, really bad. And so they were so bad that EA was like, wait a minute, getting back to the thing we were talking about earlier, they were like, why should we give skins to teams if they can't even move, 50K, in some cases, like 50K worth of banners? And so teams were like, well, banners aren't that great. Skins are great. And EA's like, no, exactly. Skins are great. That's why they're selling, not because of anything you're doing, but because skins are great. And so it kind of set off this whole thing. And so now, I don't know about most, but certainly many of the largest esports teams have now left the Apex ecosystem. It's like a big scandal. But from my perspective, it's kind of like, yeah, that's like how a marketplace works. Like if both sides can't agree on how much value they're offering, they just won't work together. And that I think is a sad outcome. So I just really hope that there's more ways to monetize than just selling skins in game, because I think what happened with EA and Apex is a perfect example of why just relying on in-game monetization is not the way.
Yeah. That's what, like, all of it is so delicate, right? Like, I feel like you never know what way the dev is going to want to go. And I wouldn't blame them for going either way, right? Like, I think Riot is so strategic about how they handle their calendar to leave room for influencers to take over in like the later parts of the year. And they also allow co-streamers to basically thrive throughout the entire esports circuit. I feel like Counter-Strike suffers because their developer literally doesn't care. So all these companies kind of were created to run the esport, and that dominates the category on Twitch. which then drives out a lot of the content creators from Counter-Strike. There's not really big Counter-Strike streamers. The big Counter-Strike streamers are now playing other games like Shroud, like Tarek. You know, sometimes they might go back and play Counter-Strike, but oftentimes it's at the risk of losing viewership to the esport, which is currently live. I think Riot is very intentional with how they structure their calendar to leave room for that. And I think EA making that decision just shows like they don't value the esport as much as probably content creators. And I don't blame them for that. Like you talked about like Epic earlier with like Fortnite. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know like what is the better play for developers. It almost seems easier to go that route. You know, just the influencer route.
The one balancing act, I mean, there's more than a few, but there's more than just one. But I do think one thing for developers to consider is like creators and influencers. These days, back in the day, there was this thing called a variety streamer. I feel like no one says that anymore. Everyone's a variety streamer now, right? Like everyone plays multiple games. And so it just feels, from my understanding, it's like you can't necessarily rely on creators to play one game forever. That's just not going to happen. Whereas it's pretty realistic to expect that esports teams or, you know, professional players are going to stick around for as long as they're pros in that ecosystem. So it just feels different. It feels like maybe esports is less about getting new eyeballs on the game outside of like maybe world championships and things like that. But maybe it's more about driving up engagement with your core audience. For most esports, again, I think there can be exceptions. And then influencers are more about reaching new audiences that maybe know of the game, but don't really play it, or maybe just have never heard of it.
Yeah. Do you think esports needs to be more in tune with its like diehard viewers? So like, obviously the people that watch esports have some kind of attachment to the game. I think you even spoke about it in your piece a lot, where it, you know, like esports need to be viewed as like an entertainment value, right? Like you don't need to play the game itself, just be like an enjoyer of the esports product.
Yeah, it's kind of like something you were saying earlier, which is that like in traditional sports, like you don't play basketball, or actually maybe you do play basketball, but I highly doubt you play football, like organized football. No. Like that's... I
lasted one practice.
Yeah, nice.
I'm not even joking, one practice.
I think I played flag football a few times and like twisted my ankle. So that's my football.
No more of this. I'm going back inside.
But the point is that in traditional sports, I think for a variety of reasons, those products, people don't play those games anymore, but they nonetheless find fun watching them. Video games are a little bit different because they're I don't care what anyone says. I have yet to play a popular game that was designed to be watched first and foremost over designed to be played, which is correct, by the way. Like if it's not fun to play, who cares if it's fun to watch? Yeah. But it makes it tricky because those are two very challenging and sometimes contradictory problems. Like I think Overwatch is fun to play. I think it is an impossible food fight of particles to watch, like unwatchable to me, but fun to play. I think that's just kind of a challenge that a lot of games deal with. And so, but I think over time, like Rocket League is a good one where I think it is fun to play, but it's also pretty easy to watch. Like I think you kind of understand what's going on in Rocket League. And so I think games in that vein, I think will continue to come out. Again, man, like I just take the long-term view of esports. I think right now we're in a down period. Let's just be honest. This is a tough time, and a bunch of big bets were made 5 to 10 years ago that esports is going to be the next NBA. It's probably not. That whole mental model is broken for a bunch of reasons. So what comes next? Well, I don't think there have been any huge new games or genres released in a hot minute. And so I think new games, new genres, new business models for games being released would really help us get there. And to your point, maybe new games, new genres that are more accessible. Like Fortnite, the degree to which Fortnite entered pop culture is like nothing I would have ever believed. No. Like you got, I mean, Among Us even, like the degree to which people I know that don't even like video games but know about Among Us and Sus and all this, insane. So I just think more games like that will come out over time. I think we'll have more games that are easier to watch than a Overwatch or a Dota or a League, but still just as fun as those awesome games to play. And
so we need more like traditional sports games run like traditional sports companies.
I just think we need games that are easy to watch. And I think most games that are super fun, again, there are exceptions. Like Mortal Kombat's pretty easy to understand. Guy grabs someone's head and pulls it off. Like that's pretty easy to follow. But Yeah, we just need games with that kind of accessibility, but also the popularity of these games like League. I think Valorant and CS are kind of in a sweet spot. They're a little bit tough to follow if you're not a gamer. I still think, but I think we're getting better about it. I think
so too.
Yeah. I'm optimistic.
There's been a lot of like clunky games that they try to force into esports. Like I think the devs have finally understood like you need it's not just about like cool team synergy, right? You need like a star player. I think it took a couple times for that to kind of fall through. Like watching a game where everyone just goes like 1-for-1 in trades, that would be so boring. You want someone to be able to pop off. You want to be able to story tell like the best player succeeding and winning championships. And in some games that's not possible. Yeah. So like, I agree actually though. I do think that right now it's a bit of a lull. I think in part that's to blame because of the pandemic and the inflated numbers that we saw like early on. We were just due for a decline after that. And I think you'd be silly to not be optimistic about gaming moving forward. It's unsure where esports is going to lie, but you'd have to say that the water is going to rise along with gaming and that we'd be in a better spot in the future. It's just, as this generation gets older, so like myself, for example, I was like a first gen pro gamer in CS and now I have 2 kids. And while my 2 kids aren't playing games yet, hopefully never, just kidding. Like it's inevitable. Like there will be the next generation of like iPad babies that come out and, like their parents will be fans and it'll be more similar to traditional sports. And when that happens, I think esports will have like a massive boom. Do you think this is like the first extinction event right now? Like, do you think the second being the legislation that comes in and like kind of, I do think a lot of the monetization in gaming and like the developers, there's not really that much legislation on the developers and on like social media platforms right now. And I think that could be like the second kind of dip in our industry.
The funny thing is that like, if you take a long enough view, like, I don't think this is the first extinction. I think the first, I don't even know when the first extinction is, honestly, but I'll tell you, there was definitely an extinction event after StarCraft, right? Like StarCraft was so huge for a minute there. And then you had this intermediary period where like StarCraft 2 came out, it didn't hit. Brood War was kind of dying, or not dying, but it was just like, it wasn't really supported anymore. Blizzard was fighting with Kespa. There's just been a couple of cycles of esports. Like if you talk to some of the StarCraft 2 OGs, I think they would agree that like it was a different era. Like when League of Legends and CS kind of dropped around 2010, it really felt like a passing of the torch moment. I think Fortnite sort of felt like that. And so anyways, the point is that I think there'll be more like that. The core is that, gaming is going to be around. Like you said, it's funny. I was talking with some friends and we were passing around this TikTok where it's like this high school, I want to say it was in Georgia. And it was like it's not cheerleaders. Who are those people that swing the batons? Batoners. I don't know.
Oh,
anyways, I don't know. Anyways, it was like the band marching through the middle of this high school with these like baton twirlers. And it was because their Fortnite team had won the state championships. And so normally you see that in like a teenage movie and it's like the football players, the basketball players. Bro, it was like the 5 gangliest kids.
They were flossing or something.
They like hands in their pockets. They look so uncomfortable. And they're like the championship Fortnite squad. And we're all laughing. We're like, man, we were born in the wrong decade. If only we were born a little bit later, it could have been us.
Dude, I know, man. Like, it's so crazy. It's so crazy. There's like literally elementary school esport teams.
Yeah.
It's wild. So to think like this is the top, I think that would be utter nonsense. But I do think that there's like going to be another wave of problems that come because of the issues I said. Like,
I think that's right. And it may be the case that like esports is just cyclical at its nature because of the fact that games don't last all that long for the most part. But you know what? I could be wrong. Here's a crazy off the wall question for you. So, I don't know if you play Pokemon very much, but on paper, I was thinking about this as I was kind of like thinking through what is like the perfect esport need. And I realized that it kind of exists in some ways. Pokemon's been around for like 30 years. The game, like the core gameplay is people fighting other people to win battles so that they can be crowned the best. And there's movies, television shows. Of course, the primary problem is that it's like turn-based, so it's not that exciting to watch for most people. And Nintendo's not huge on esports, but a buddy of mine was visiting me recently, and he's like, he's visiting me in Seattle. And he's like, I'm actually bringing my daughter. We're going to hit up a Pokemon tournament, a father-daughter Pokemon tournament. So I'm going to play in the adult bracket. She's going to play in like the under 5 or the 5 and under bracket. And then we'll come visit you. And I was like, wait, there are Pokemon tournaments for fathers and daughters? He's like, yeah, their age divisions are different. But yeah, he's like, it's going to be great. And I was just like, I feel like I'm so ensconced in the esports industry and I've never even heard of this. And so I really did a deep dive and I was like, wow,
have to be noobs, right? I feel like we could mop that up. No? Have to be. I've never heard of this. I feel like the level of competition would be so low. I'm about to scoop that first place up right now.
Oh man, people got spreadsheets on spreadsheets in the adult division. But the point is that I think like it was just cool to me that like, from my understanding, no one's making life-changing money off Pokemon esports. Nintendo's not selling franchise spots, but it's semi-organically become, I did some research, it gets, 6figure viewership on Twitch and YouTube when it goes live. Wow. There's people go to London, people from across the world fly in. They have all these regional tournaments and Nintendo flies out people to the World Championship. Point is just this, is that I just feel like the concept of people competing at something that they love is so universal, and video games, to your point, are just going to get so much more popular over time that even if esports never becomes the NBA, whatever that means, I still think the trajectory is up over time. We're just in a down period.
For sure. I think like the landscape might change a lot. Like, I don't know. I mean, we talked a lot about like, the devs being the owners of like the platforms and stuff. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't shock me if they were the teams in the future too. Riot is the dev. They're making a play for the platform. They're the tournament organizer. And the only one remaining is the teams. Like, would it shock me? It wouldn't shock me. I do feel like but then the other side is like, I wouldn't be surprised if it went Valve's way. And, Valve just allowed people to sell the broadcast rights. And that's how, esports thrived in that style. Like, it could go two totally different ways here.
I feel like the Valve approach is going to be really rare, only because I just think Valve at core, it's not a video game IP company. They're a game storefront, right? Certainly that's what the P&L says. And so I just think that it's not that they don't care, but I just think that it's less dangerous for them, I think, to let third parties just like take a hold of their IP and kind of do stuff with it. But even Valve has standards, right? Like, I remember there were like some like adult websites that wanted to sponsor teams or run tournaments. And I believe Valve put some restrictions on that. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah. So there's like a line even for Valve, right? Where they're like, oh, okay. Like, at this point, you can do whatever you want, except actually maybe not at this point. And so I think it's just, it's just hard for me to imagine too many people are going to be that willing to let people do whatever they want with the IP.
Yeah. But when does it become like just too much of a headache for Riot? They've hired so many people. They've ballooned out in so many different areas. They have offices all over the world to deal with this. Whereas Valve can just be like, fuck it. We're just going to get free marketing. Like, you guys do whatever you want. If you ever fuck up too bad, we'll come in and we'll just be like, hey, don't do that. I feel like that is way less of a headache. It just seems so easy for them. I don't know.
You're right. It is less of a headache. I think, though, that companies like Apple or Disney or Riot, I would put in that category, that are sort of like IP-based companies. Apple's arguably not an IP-based company, but I think they're so maniacal about their like brand that I put them in the bucket. They just hate other people touching their IP. It's so important to them that they control the product. And it's not just a control fixation thing. I think it's so important that they control their brand because, I think it was interesting when TFT came out. Like, I feel like Auto or even Valorant, The first thing I heard when TFT and Valorant both came out was, oh man, it's a Riot game. I'm trying it out. Like there's just an implicit trust. There's a clip from Dr. Disrespect who I've never even seen him stream like League or anything, but he's like, oh, I heard Riot Games is working on the shooter. You know, it's going to be good. Like he was just really praising Riot. And I think that's why you're so maniacal about Control, is that there's this trust. Like, oh, when I touch an Apple product, when I play a Riot game, there's going to be this quality bar that I just trust is going to be insane. And the reality is like third parties don't necessarily have the same level of seriousness about brand. And so I just think, yeah, there's going to be publishers that are like lackadaisical and cool with just anyone touching their IP, but I really think the serious heavy hitters are just never going to be cool with third parties doing whatever they want, the way Valve is.
I agree, actually. I think the way Riot does their marketing is just like masterful. Like as someone that's been in both scenes, I can see all of like the deliberate reach they have into like all these different areas, and like developing the storylines with the players, like appealing to the cosplayers over here, like appealing to this language over there, having broadcasts specific to this region. And they do all kind of plays. Like they set apart challenger leagues for Italy. Like I'm over here wondering like how the fuck is that going to be profitable? Like that's insane to me. But like they do these things and they put a lot of research into if they can succeed doing the plays they make. Like I don't know. It's very interesting to see how Riot operates as someone that was from the CS:GO scene. Because,
I think that's right. The only thing I'd say about the Riot approach is that like Riot is a company that goes for like big swings, like for their games, right? And so like we know, at this point Riot has quite a few games, but back in the day the joke was that it was Riot Game, not Riot Games, right? Because they only had League. And the reason is that they were so ruthless about killing off R&D projects that were not like genre defining. And so I think like for a lot of games, it doesn't make sense to go as big and burn as much money and take the risks that Riot, as an extremely successful and ambitious company, can afford to take. So I feel like everyone wants to be Riot. That's what I thought when I saw Overwatch League, to be honest with you. I was kind of like, yeah, this game hasn't even come out yet, and they're talking about like, the NBA and the NFL. Like, it seems a little premature to me personally, but like, I think there's lessons to learn from like the way that Nintendo does Pokemon. I know that's not a popular opinion. No one's getting rich off that. But if you care about creating a sustainable product for fans, I think most games aren't going to be a League of Legends or a CSGO. So trying to scale up this massive esports program, probably very dangerous. And so I think like going grassroots and experimenting with sustainable stuff like that, I don't think you always have to go for the Grand Slam, I guess is all I'm saying. But when you do have to, yeah, Riot's best in class.
Dude, they're insane. Like what genre of game will they not have like a big player in? Because they have like the fighting game coming out, they have League, they have Valorant, they have TFT.
It depends.
Like Arcane is obviously out as like a show. They have the Valorant movie or whatever that they just announced coming out at some point.
Yeah, they have tons. I mean, I think on my wish list, obviously everyone wants the MMO. Looter shooter would be cool. I think more mobile games would be cool. I feel like I like mobile games, but they're so exploitative, man. They're just like, they're all gacha games now. So I'd love to see Riot take a shot at a mobile game that's a little less. They have Wild Rift, but that's basically a port of League. I mean, like a native mobile game that Riot built. I think that'd be cool.
Do you just love losing all your money, Ovi, just to these microtransactions? That's all these mobile games do.
There are some mobile games, like I'm playing Marvel Snap right now and I really enjoy it. But yeah, the monetization for these mobile games, it's predatory, man. It's predatory. They're after that wallet. Let's not lie.
Do you think like the esports games are predatory at all? Like the CSGO case openings, or even like, I don't know, like the skin market, like you deposit money, you get coins, like do you think that at all is predatory?
I don't know. So CSGO case openings are like absolute. I don't understand the difference between buying a case opening and like gambling without getting into that whole thing. Like that's like a whole, I don't have a problem with it. It just seems it's not only is it a loot box, but it's a loot box that you like pay money. It's if you've ever played like slots, like if you ever watched like Rothstein on Twitch, like a lot of the UX is like pretty similar to what's going on with CS:GO savings. I'm not the first person to observe that, I'm sure, but I don't think it's exploitative, although I don't have a gambling addiction, so maybe for someone else it is. But I think most of these, I think we kind of hit this golden era where there were these games that came out in 2010, these first era of live service games were really able to just monetize on cosmetics. I think times have changed, and now gacha is the new wave where like you can't buy the skin, you have to buy a token which opens a chest which has a 15% chance, but there's a pity timer. Like it is what it is, right?
Small breathing fee like mixed in there. Like they get you in everything, man.
They get you in everything, but it was that CS era, the 2010s, I think was incredibly fair for like League, Fortnite, a lot of these games, very, very fair compared to mobile games for sure.
Just like wrapping things up, I do want to say like I am very positive. I'm trying to not be like a pessimistic Polly here. I'm just being a realist. I think I am very optimistic about the scene in general. I think right now it's obviously in a pain point. I don't know how it gets out of it is the problem. I think it's going to bleed pretty hard for a while on the esports side, and it's going to be really painful when like the Band-Aid's completely ripped off. But it seems like the right players in the scene are allowing that to happen rather than just like throwing money at the problem and aiding it. So I don't know, Ovi. Like, when do you think this all gets better?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, the way that I think about it, like as a framework, is that we are at the tail end of the traditional sports era. It's not going to have a happy ending. That unhappy ending is still unfolding, whether it's like FaZe or the Guard or just every other day. It feels like there's a new headline. When I was writing that article, like 15 bad things happened while I was writing it that forced me to update it. Like I was writing it, it's like, oh, the LCS players are about to strike. Oh, like, Overwatch League is dying. Oh, actually, like the Guard. And I was like, oh my God, like I'm just going to give up trying to be topical for all this stuff. There's too much bad news at once. But I think there'll be a new era in much the same way that I think there's kind of the StarCraft 2 era. And then the thing that actually bridged us, I think, from StarCraft 2 to this new era was live service games. The biggest problem with Blizzard was that for esports was that if you buy a copy of StarCraft 2 for $50, that's it. There's no microtransactions. So you playing the game more doesn't really drive much more money to Blizzard. So esports for StarCraft, it's just hard to attribute a ton more value. But then, with skins and League and CS, et cetera, it was much easier to pitch like, oh, okay, well, the more people play the game, the more money they spend over time. This all makes sense over time. So what does the next phase look like? I don't know exactly. Like I said, I think new games, new genres will perhaps be helpful. I think what Riot's doing with their streaming platform, not the streaming platform itself, I think that's a really hard problem to solve for what it's worth, but the idea of having microtransactions for people watching events, that is gold. I'm so confident that there's something at the end of that rainbow, but it's just going to take time to figure out what exactly that is. And unfortunately, I don't think YouTube and Twitch have a lot of incentive to work on that. So either you like do hacked third-party solutions or you just build your own like Riot. So it'll take a little while to get there, but I really do think microtransactions for esports viewing events will be a big thing. And I think it'll either be that or a new type of game with a new business model like we saw with live service. I think that'll do it. But right now we're waiting, man. It's just, just kind of got to wait for the end of this era.
Yeah, we're in the lull of the traditional sports era and shortly after the abandonment of the platforms. No more Twitch deals.
yeah, that's its own whole thing, right? With like Twitch and YouTube.
So all right, Ovi, I'm gonna let you go, man. But this has been super awesome. I always love talking like the economic side of the industry. You've informed me so much, dude. I know you do.
This is always such a blast talking to you, man. You've been in esports forever, but also you've been in like quite a few different ecosystems. Like Riot ecosystems will always be home for me, but you've lived in many countries, so to speak.
I'm a cockroach, dude. I'm fucking getting around over here. They can't kill me. They can't kill me.
I love it, dude.
All right, dude. Thank you so much. I'm going to end it right here.